What happens when one of Hollywood's most admired stars walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a friendly conversation and instead finds himself in the middle of a tense, unexpected confrontation that leaves the entire studio holding its breath? That's exactly what happened the day Henry Cavill stepped onto the set of The View, sitting across from veteran host Sunny Hostin. What started as a routine interview quickly turned into one of the most talked about moments the show had seen in years. But before we dive into what really happened, make sure to subscribe to Live Narratives, hit that like button, and comment below with your first impression of this story. Because what unfolded that day, nobody saw coming. The lights inside the studio glowed bright as the audience settled into their seats. Cameras glided silently across the polished floor, producers whispered through headsets, and the familiar theme music of The View echoed through the room. Everything looked perfectly normal. But beneath the polished smiles and practiced introductions, something in the air felt different. When Henry Cavill walked onto the stage, the crowd erupted in cheers. He carried the calm confidence fans had come to admire, tall, composed, offering a polite wave as he greeted the hosts. Sunny Hostin leaned forward with a welcoming smile. "Henry," she said warmly, extending her hand. "It's so great to have you here." "Thank you," Cavill replied, shaking her hand with his usual calm charm. "It's wonderful to be here." The audience applauded again. For a moment, everything felt like the typical talk show energy, friendly banter, laughter, the comfortable rhythm of celebrity interviews. Sunny began with the obvious topic. "So," she said, glancing at her notes, "you've played some of the most iconic characters in film, heroes people look up to." Henry nodded politely. "I've been fortunate," he said. "Very fortunate." "But," Sunny continued, her tone shifting just slightly, "with that kind of influence comes responsibility." A faint pause spread across the table. Henry tilted his head a little, curious. "Of course," he said carefully. The audience didn't notice it yet, but the other hosts did. That subtle shift in Sunny's voice. It wasn't confrontational yet, but it wasn't casual either. Sunny leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Let me ask you something," she said. "Do you ever feel pressure, knowing millions of people see you as a symbol of strength and morality?" Henry considered the question. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "I think storytelling has always carried meaning. But my job as an actor is to portray characters honestly." The crowd nodded along. But Sunny wasn't finished. She leaned forward again. "Yes, but some critics say certain portrayals, particularly of power and heroism, can send the wrong message in today's social climate." The temperature in the room shifted. Henry's eyebrows lifted slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. "Oh," he said. Sunny nodded. "There's been debate online," she continued, "about whether traditional hero narratives, particularly male-driven ones, still reflect the world we live in." A murmur rippled through the audience. The other hosts exchanged quick glances. Henry folded his hands calmly on the table. "I think stories evolve with the times," he replied. "But heroism itself, courage, sacrifice, doing what's right, those are timeless ideas." The audience applauded lightly, but Sunny's expression remained serious. "Some would argue," she said slowly, "that those stories have historically centered a very specific type of hero." Now the silence in the studio grew heavier. The conversation had officially stepped away from promotion and into something deeper. Henry remained composed, but inside he was beginning to realize something. This wasn't going to be a typical interview. "Are you suggesting," he asked carefully, "that certain stories shouldn't be told anymore?" Sunny shook her head slightly. "No," she said, "but I do think we should question who gets to be the hero and why." Another murmur swept through the audience. One woman in the front row leaned forward in her seat, whispering to her friend. The tension was subtle but growing. Henry took a breath before responding. "I think storytelling thrives on diversity," he said. "Different heroes, different perspectives." Sunny nodded. "But when actors with global influence," she said, gesturing toward him, "continue portraying traditional archetypes, it raises questions about cultural impact." The room fell quiet. For the first time since walking on stage, Henry Cavill leaned back slightly in his chair. Not defensive, but alert. His voice remained calm. Respectfully, he said, I believe audiences connect with stories because they resonate emotionally, not because of a checklist. A few audience members clapped. Others remained silent. Sunny's eyes narrowed slightly, not in hostility, but in focused curiosity. So, you don't think actors have a responsibility to push narratives forward socially? Henry paused, choosing his words carefully. I think responsibility lies in telling meaningful stories, he replied. But storytelling shouldn't feel forced. A ripple passed through the crowd. Some nodded. Others exchanged uneasy looks. And suddenly, what had begun as a polite discussion was starting to feel like something else entirely. The kind of conversation daytime television rarely allowed to unfold without friction. Sunny rested her hands on the table. Her voice softened, but her words carried weight. Some might say that perspective comes from a place of privilege. The audience gasped. A producer offstage shifted nervously. Even the co-hosts looked surprised. Because that line had just changed everything. Henry didn't react immediately, but the shift in his expression was impossible to miss. Not anger, not defensiveness, something else. A quiet realization that the conversation had crossed an invisible line. For the first time, the entire studio felt the tension. Every camera locked in. Every audience member leaned forward. And Henry Cavill slowly spoke. Well, he said calmly, that depends on how you define privilege. The air in the studio froze. And, in that moment, everyone realized this interview was about to become something far bigger than anyone expected. And the real clash had only just begun. The studio fell into a strange silence after Henry Cavill calmly asked the question that now hung in the air like a suspended storm. Well, he had said quietly, that depends on how you define privilege. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the familiar hum of cameras seemed to fade as the tension inside the studio grew thicker. Across the table, Sunny Hostin watched him carefully. Her expression wasn't hostile, but it was intense, analytical. The kind of look someone gives when they're trying to peel back a layer of a conversation that most people prefer to keep comfortable. The audience could feel it. This was no longer a routine talk show exchange. Sunny folded her hands together on the table. Well, she said slowly, many people would say privilege means benefiting from systems that weren't always fair to everyone. Henry listened without interrupting. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, but he didn't immediately respond. And that pause, just a few seconds long, made the studio even quieter. One of the co-hosts shifted in her chair. A camera operator near the back adjusted his angle, sensing the moment was becoming something far more serious than anyone had expected when the interview began. Henry leaned forward slightly. I think conversations about fairness are important, he said calmly. But I also think it's dangerous when we start reducing people to categories. A ripple passed through the audience. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Dangerous? She repeated. Henry kept his voice measured. Yes, he said. Because when we stop seeing individuals and start seeing labels, we risk losing empathy. Some audience members began clapping. Others remained still, clearly unsure which side of the discussion they agreed with. Sunny's gaze sharpened. But labels often exist because of real historical patterns, she countered. They help us understand systems that have shaped society. Henry nodded again. That's true, he admitted. But I also believe people are more complex than the roles history assigns them. The room was now fully absorbed in the exchange. What had begun as an interview promoting a film had transformed into a philosophical debate unfolding live on daytime television. One audience member whispered, "This is intense." Sunny leaned forward. "Let me ask you something directly," she said. Henry met her gaze. "Of course." She glanced briefly at her notes before looking back up. "You've played characters like Superman, icons of power and moral authority. Some critics argue that these characters often represent outdated ideals." A few audience members murmured. Henry gave a faint smile. "Well," he said, "truth, justice, courage. I wouldn't call those outdated." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. But Sunny didn't smile. "What critics mean," she clarified, "is that the image of the hero has historically excluded many voices." Henry's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a fair concern," he replied. And I think storytelling is evolving to reflect that. Sunny tilted her head slightly. But do you think Hollywood is evolving fast enough? Henry chuckled softly. Hollywood rarely moves fast with anything. The audience laughed again, easing the tension for a brief moment. But Sunny quickly brought the conversation back. Still, she said, actors with your level of influence could choose roles that push social narratives forward more aggressively. The room quieted again. Henry's fingers rested calmly on the table. He looked around briefly at the audience before answering. I think meaningful change happens when stories feel authentic, he said, not when they're created purely to deliver a message. A few claps echoed through the studio. Sunny nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. But some would argue that neutrality can also maintain the status quo. That line landed heavily. One of the co-hosts glanced toward the producers offstage. The conversation was edging closer and closer to uncomfortable territory. Henry took a breath. I don't believe in neutrality when it comes to compassion, he said. But storytelling shouldn't punish people for enjoying timeless archetypes. Sunny studied him again. So, you believe audiences should decide what narratives succeed? Yes, Henry replied. Audiences have always shaped culture. Another murmur swept through the room. Sunny leaned back in her chair now, folding her arms slightly. And what happens, she asked, when audiences resist change? Henry paused. It was a longer pause this time. You could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind as he chose his words carefully. Then creators keep telling new stories, he said finally. But they shouldn't erase the old ones. Some applause erupted from the audience. Others remained silent. The divide in the room was becoming noticeable. Sunny noticed it too. Her tone softened slightly. You know, she said, some viewers might say this conversation reflects a bigger cultural debate happening right now. Henry nodded. I think you're right. And debates like this, Sunny added, can get heated. Henry gave a small smile. Only if we forget we're all human. The audience clapped again. But just as the atmosphere began to ease, Sunny said something that made the room freeze all over again. Let me push a little further, she said. Henry looked curious. How so? Sunny leaned forward slowly. Some critics online have accused you of avoiding political positions entirely. A collective, oh, rippled through the audience. Because now the conversation had stepped into truly dangerous territory for celebrities. Politics. Henry's smile faded slightly. Not in anger. More like someone realizing the ground beneath them had just shifted again. Sunny continued. They say influential figures sometimes stay neutral to protect their careers. The cameras zoomed in closer. The producers backstage exchanged worried glances. Because if this conversation kept escalating, it could become one of the most controversial interviews the show had aired in years. Henry sat back in his chair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but firm. I think people assume silence always means fear, he said. Sunny watched him closely. And it doesn't, she asked. Henry shook his head slightly. Sometimes it means humility. The audience went quiet again. And, for the first time, even Sunny seemed caught off guard by that answer. But what neither of them realized yet was that the conversation was about to take an even sharper turn, one that would leave the audience gasping, the host scrambling, and the internet exploding with debate within hours. Because the next question Sunny was about to ask would push this conversation far beyond a philosophical disagreement and straight into a clash neither side had expected. The silence after that last exchange felt heavier than anything that had happened so far. Inside the studio of The View, the audience sat frozen, sensing that the conversation between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin had reached a point where neither side could easily step back. Sunny tapped her pen lightly against the table, her eyes locked on Henry. So humility, she repeated slowly. That's an interesting word. Henry nodded calmly. I think it's important, he said, especially when millions of people are watching and listening. Sunny leaned slightly forward. But some people feel that public figures, especially those with global reach, have a responsibility to speak out clearly on major issues. The audience watched carefully. Every movement, every word. Henry rested his hands together, fingers interlocked. I understand why people feel that way, he replied. But I also believe there's value in encouraging people to think for themselves. Sunny raised an eyebrow. You don't think speaking out helps guide that thinking? Henry paused. I think sometimes it can, he said. But sometimes it can also shut down discussion. A few quiet murmurs spread through the audience. Sunny tilted her head slightly. Because people disagree? Because people stop listening, Henry answered gently. That line landed differently. Not defensive, not confrontational, just calm. And for a brief second, the tension softened. But Sunny wasn't done pushing the conversation. You know, she said, glancing briefly toward the audience, there's a perception that celebrities often enjoy the benefits of influence without accepting the responsibility that comes with it. Henry smiled faintly. That's a fair criticism in some cases. The honesty in his answer caught a few people off guard. Sunny noticed it too. So, where do you draw the line? She asked. Henry leaned back slightly in his chair, thinking. Well, he said slowly, I think the line appears when conversations stop being about ideas and start becoming about attacking people. A ripple of applause moved through part of the audience. Sunny watched him carefully. Are you suggesting that public debate has become too personal? Henry nodded. I think that happens a lot these days. The room grew quiet again, because everyone knew exactly what he meant. Sunny tapped her pen again, clearly thinking. Then she said something that made the entire studio shift forward in their seats. Some critics, she said carefully, have argued that certain fan communities around major franchises can become resistant to change. Henry's eyes flickered slightly. He knew where this might be going. And actors associated with those franchises, Sunny continued, sometimes reinforce that resistance. A few audience members murmured. Others immediately shook their heads. Henry remained composed. I think fans are passionate because they love the stories, he said. Sunny nodded. But passion can sometimes become gatekeeping. Henry paused again. That's possible, he admitted. But dismissing passion can also alienate the very people who made those stories successful. A louder wave of applause spread through the audience this time. One man in the second row clapped enthusiastically. Sunny noticed the reaction. Her expression remained calm, but her tone sharpened slightly. So when fans push back against changes meant to include more voices, you think that's just passion? Henry answered carefully. I think every situation is different. Sunny leaned forward again. But do you think resistance to representation is ever justified? The question hung in the air, like a spark near dry wood. The audience went completely silent. Even the other hosts were watching closely now. Henry took a breath. I think conversations about representation are important, he said slowly. Sunny nodded, encouraging him to continue. But Henry added, representation should come from genuine storytelling, not from forcing narratives that audiences feel disconnected from. Some people clapped immediately. Others remained quiet. The room felt divided. Sunny noticed it. So authenticity matters more than intent? She asked. Henry smiled faintly. I think authenticity creates better stories. Sunny sat back slightly. Critics might say that's an easy position to take when the industry has historically favored people who look like you. A collective gasp moved through the studio. One of the co-hosts glanced nervously toward the producers. Because that line had pushed the discussion somewhere far more personal. Henry didn't respond immediately. His face remained calm, but the pause stretched longer than any before. You could almost hear the audience holding their breath. Finally, he spoke. I understand why people feel that way, he said quietly. Sunny waited. But, Henry continued, I also think assuming someone's journey based on appearance alone can be unfair. A few audience members clapped softly. Sunny studied him carefully. Unfair how? She asked. Henry leaned slightly forward now, his voice still calm, but carrying more weight than before. Because every person's story is different, he said. And when we reduce people to assumptions, we risk repeating the very problem we're trying to solve. The audience reaction was immediate. Some applauded strongly. Others whispered among themselves. Sunny rested her hands on the table again, clearly considering his words. The debate had grown deeper than either of them expected when the interview began. But just as the moment seemed to settle, Sunny looked directly at Henry and asked the question that would send the conversation into its most intense moment yet. "Let me ask you something honestly," she said. Henry nodded. "Of course." Sunny's voice dropped slightly. "Do you think Hollywood is afraid to challenge actors like you?" The audience gasped. Even the other hosts looked stunned. Because now the conversation wasn't about culture anymore. It was about power. The cameras zoomed in closer. Henry blinked once, clearly surprised by the direction of the question. But instead of reacting defensively, he simply leaned forward, clasped his hands together on the table, and smiled. A calm, knowing smile. "Well," he said slowly, "I guess we're about to find out." And suddenly the studio erupted with murmurs, whispers, and nervous laughter, because everyone could feel it. The real clash was just beginning. The studio lights felt brighter now, almost harsh, as the conversation reached a point where every word carried weight. What had begun as a thoughtful debate had transformed into something far more intense, and everyone inside the set of The View could feel it. Across the table, Sunny Hostin watched Henry Cavill with the careful focus of someone who knew the next few minutes could define the entire interview. The audience shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, elbows on their knees. Others crossed their arms, waiting. Henry had just said something that lingered in the air like a challenge. "Well," he had said calmly, "I guess we're about to find out." For a moment, Sunny didn't respond. She studied him, measuring his tone, his body language, the quiet confidence in the way he sat there. Then she exhaled softly and spoke. "You know," she said, "some people might say actors, especially ones with massive fan bases, hold enormous cultural influence." Henry nodded. "That's true." Sunny tilted her head slightly. "And that influence can shape how audiences think about issues like identity, equality, and power." Henry remained composed. "I agree it can." "But," Sunny continued, "with that influence comes accountability." The word hung in the air. Accountability. The audience murmured quietly. Henry rested his hands on the table again. "And I don't disagree with that," he replied. Sunny seemed slightly surprised by the calmness of his answer. "But accountability," Henry added gently, "should apply to everyone in the conversation." The audience reacted immediately, some clapping, others exchanging looks. Sunny raised an eyebrow. "Everyone?" "Yes," Henry said. He leaned forward just slightly now, his tone still respectful but unmistakably firm. "Actors, journalists, audiences, all of us." Sunny crossed her arms lightly, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "So, you think media figures share the same responsibility?" Henry gave a small nod. "I think anyone who influences public conversation carries responsibility." A few audience members applauded louder now. One woman near the back whispered, "He's good." Sunny noticed the reaction. Her expression remained calm, but the tension between the two perspectives had become undeniable. "Well," she said slowly, "journalists are supposed to challenge people in power." Henry smiled faintly. "And I respect that." Sunny leaned forward again. "But sometimes challenging power means making people uncomfortable." Henry chuckled softly. "I think we can both agree on that." The audience laughed lightly, releasing some of the pressure that had built over the last several minutes. But Sunny's next words tightened the atmosphere again. "You've built a career playing powerful men," she said. Henry nodded. "Some people admire that," she continued. "Others question what those portrayals represent in a changing world." Henry took a breath. "I think strong characters exist in every culture and every identity," he said. "And storytelling is richer when it reflects that variety." Sunny tapped her pen lightly again. "But critics might say the industry has been slow to share that spotlight." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I agree that the industry has room to grow." The honesty in his response seemed to catch Sunny slightly off guard again. She studied him carefully. "So, you do believe Hollywood needs to evolve?" Henry smiled. "Hollywood has always been evolving." Sunny tilted her head. "But some would argue it evolves only when pressured." Henry considered that for a moment. "That may be true," he said. "But meaningful change tends to last longer when people feel invited into it, not pushed out of it." A louder wave of applause broke out from several audience members. Sunny noticed it immediately. And for the first time in the conversation, she paused longer than usual before speaking, because the audience reaction was starting to shape the room. Some people clearly supported Henry's perspective. Others were quietly nodding along with Sunny's earlier points. The studio had become a mirror of the larger cultural conversation happening outside those walls. Sunny leaned back in her chair. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this conversation reflects something bigger than just an interview." Henry nodded slowly. "I agree. It reflects a moment where people are trying to figure out how to talk to each other again." Henry smiled. "That's a good way to put it." For a brief second, the tension eased. But then Sunny said something that sent a ripple through the room once again. "However," she added carefully, "some viewers might say conversations like this only happen because you're someone the industry respects." Henry blinked slightly. Sunny continued, "They might wonder if lesser-known actors would be given the same platform or the same patience." The audience reacted with quiet murmurs. Henry leaned back, considering her words. "That's a fair question," he said. Sunny waited. "But I think respect is earned through how people treat others," Henry continued. "Not just through fame." Several audience members clapped again. Sunny studied him one more time. The tension between them had softened slightly, but the energy of the conversation was still powerful. Then a producer offstage subtly signaled that the segment was nearing its end. Sunny glanced briefly toward the camera before turning back to Henry. "Well," she said, her tone calmer now, "I think this might be one of the most honest conversations we've had on this show in a long time." Henry smiled politely. "I'm glad we could have it." But neither of them realized yet that the real storm wasn't happening inside the studio anymore. It was happening outside. Because while the conversation had been unfolding live, clips were already spreading across the internet. Viewers were posting reactions. Commentators were taking sides. And within minutes, the exchange between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin was exploding across social media. What happened next would turn this intense conversation into one of the most debated talk show moments of the year. The moment the cameras stopped rolling inside the studio of The View, something unusual happened. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The lights were still blazing overhead, the audience still seated, the host still at the table. But the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something quieter, almost reflective. Across the table, Sunny Hostin rested her hands on the desk, glancing toward Henry Cavill. The conversation they had just finished wasn't a typical celebrity segment. It hadn't been promotional. It hadn't been playful. It had been real. And everyone in that room knew it. Some audience members began clapping again, this time not as part of the show but as a spontaneous reaction. The applause grew stronger, echoing across the studio. Henry stood up first, offering a polite nod to the crowd. "Thank you," he said warmly. Sunny rose as well, giving him a respectful smile. "Thank you for being open to the discussion," she said. Henry shook her hand. "Thank you for having the conversation." The exchange was calm, even cordial. But outside the studio walls, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Because during the live broadcast, clips from the debate had started appearing online. Within minutes, social media platforms were flooding with reactions. Short videos showing the moment Sunny said the word privilege. Clips of Henry responding calmly about humility. Segments where the audience erupted in applause. Every angle of the conversation was being dissected. On one side, some viewers praised Sunny for asking difficult questions. She held him accountable, one commenter wrote. On the other side, many praised Henry for his composure. He stayed calm and respectful the entire time. Another post read. Soon, the debate wasn't just about the interview anymore. It had become part of a much larger cultural conversation. Entertainment websites began posting headlines about the exchange between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin on The View. Commentators on television discussed the moment. Podcasters analyzed every line. Within hours, the phrase Cavill versus Hostin was trending across multiple platforms. Back inside the studio, however, the energy had softened. Some audience members approached the stage as the crew prepared for the next segment. A few people thanked the hosts for the discussion. Others complimented Henry on how he handled the questions. One woman in the front row said quietly, "That was one of the most interesting interviews I've ever seen here." Henry smiled politely. "Thank you," he said. Nearby, Sunny was speaking with one of the producers. "People are going to talk about that," the producer whispered. Sunny glanced briefly toward Henry before nodding. "I hope they do," she replied. "That's the point of conversations like this." Meanwhile, Henry gathered his jacket from the back of his chair. One of the other hosts walked over to him. "You handled that well," she said with a grin. Henry chuckled softly. "I think everyone handled it well," he replied. But as he walked backstage, he could already hear staff members discussing their phones. "Look at this," one assistant said. Another responded, "It's everywhere." Henry glanced at one of the screens. Clips from the interview were already circulating with thousands, then hundreds of thousands of views. Comment sections were filling rapidly. Some people debated the meaning of privilege. Others argued about celebrity influence. And many simply praised the fact that the conversation had remained respectful despite its intensity. Later that evening, entertainment journalists began publishing full breakdowns of the moment. Some called it a rare, unscripted clash. Others described it as a surprisingly thoughtful debate. One article described it as a reminder that real dialogue is still possible on live television. Sunny, meanwhile, addressed the moment during a brief follow-up discussion later in the show. "These are the conversations people are having at home," she told viewers. "And our job is to bring those conversations into the open." Across town, Henry was preparing to leave the studio. A reporter caught him near the exit. "Henry," the reporter asked quickly, "any thoughts about the interview today?" Henry paused. He smiled politely. "I appreciate thoughtful discussions," he said simply. Then he stepped into his car. But the story didn't stop there. Over the next several days, the interview continued to spread online. Clips reached millions of views. Reaction videos appeared across YouTube. Some viewers supported Sunny's challenging questions. Others admired Henry's calm responses. And many people said something even more interesting. They said the moment showed what debate should look like: two people disagreeing without hostility. In a media environment often dominated by shouting matches and viral outrage, that alone made the conversation stand out. Weeks later, some fans still talked about it. Not because it was explosive, but because it was unexpected. Two public figures from very different worlds sitting across from each other, asking difficult questions and answering them honestly. And maybe that's why the moment resonated so widely. Because it reminded people that conversations, even uncomfortable ones, can still be respectful. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this intense moment between Henry Cavill and Sunny Hostin on The View? Was Sunny right to push the conversation further? Or did Henry handle the situation in the best possible way? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy dramatic, cinematic stories about unforgettable moments like this, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, like this video, and share it with your friends. Because the next story we uncover might be even more shocking than this one.